I think from his point of view and Reform's point of view, it's a mistake.
So many of the high-profile defections have so far been strong Boris Johnson supporters. But Farage hates Boris. Boris hates Farage.
But Boris is, he's Richard Feynman. He's Albert Einstein in comparison to Nadhim. Hello and welcome to Quite Right, the Spectator's weekly podcast, with me, Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And me, Madeline Grant, assistant editor of The Spectator.
And this week on Quite Right, we'll be discussing Nadhim Zahawi's defection to reform. Who does it help? Who does it harm? And what is the role that Boris plays in all this? We'll also be discussing the street protests in Iran. Is this the portent of real regime change? And Elon, is he a force for good or evil?
Michael, this week there was a pretty big defection to Reform UK. Nadhim Zahawi, a former Chancellor, former Education Secretary, former party chairman and vaccine minister of the Tory party, defected to Reform in a press conference that Reform often have these press conferences and the results of them are not always that surprising. But I felt that Westminster was fairly taken aback by what happened yesterday. What did you make of it?
Well, it's certainly the case that Nadhim has a storied CV. So he was, albeit just for a few months, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he certainly won plaudits as vaccine minister for overseeing the rollout of the vaccine during COVID. And he was an engaging education secretary. And I can't, I'm afraid, hide the fact that I had and still have a soft spot for him. He's very entertaining company. But I think from his point of view and Reform's point of view, it's a mistake. It confirms what Nadhim's critics will think of him, which is that he's more opportunist than idealist. And it will also, I think, create the impression that Reform is essentially a sort of pirate crew that will take on anyone who's been cashiered from office elsewhere in order to sail under their Jolly Roger. And rather than being a genuine movement of insurgent protest, they're a salon de refusés. And I think that many more voters might be tempted to refuse voting for them if they carry on in this way.
But crucially that, they're not taking just anyone. So far, the defections are almost exclusively from the Tory party,
yes,
which is its own problem, I think, because Reform hoped to pick up disaffected voters, not just of a Tory persuasion, but also Labour voters in the Red Wall and elsewhere. So I do think it's a bit of a problem that it so often is a high-profile Tory. There also seems to be, I would say, a bit of a conundrum here for Reform UK, which is, on the one hand, they need to have experienced people that have some dealings with Whitehall in the past, who understand how to get to grips with the machine. We heard in our interview with Dominic Cummings the utter complexity of that. You do need people with some kind of insider knowledge. But equally, the only people with that kind of experience willing to join Reform at the moment appear to be Tories.
Yes, and I think there's been some indication that there will be a former Labour figure who will join Reform. And indeed,
it's interesting.
There are some Reform supporters who have been Labour politicians. So he's controversial, but Simon Danczuk, the former Rochdale MP, I think, has joined Reform, been a Reform candidate. And I think it's also the case that there are councillors from Lancashire and elsewhere who've been, fairly senior in the Labour Party.
I'm talking about people who've been in government.
But at a big level, you're totally right. And I think the other thing, following on from the point that Dominic made in our Christmas podcast interview, is that for Reform really to succeed as an outsider movement, it needs people who haven't had anything to do with politics. And they might have been people who voted Tory before or didn't vote. But where are the fresh, clean skins, untainted by the compromises and the failures of the past, who are now presenting themselves as the phalanx, the new brooms who will sweep away the encrustations of self-interest that Reform believe, with some justification, get in the way of real change.
This is their USP, which is basically, we are the outsiders, we're not the establishment, we're different from the people you hate. But so far, not all of them, but some of the people they've had crossing the floor, it's basically been like, we're the Tory party, but the ones you didn't like. I'm not sure like
Yeah.
what a sell that is to the public. And I think, frankly, although, as you said, Nadhim Zahawi is a competent man. He had some success as a minister, and before entering Parliament, did some impressive things setting up YouGov. He'd probably be very good at fundraising, for example, for Reform UK. Like, he does have his advantages. But if there's one thing the public do know about him, it will be his tax affairs.
Yes. You can be unlucky in politics. You can acquire a reputation, which may not necessarily do you complete justice. But Nadhim has been unlucky in that during the expenses sort of investigation, one of the challenges was that he had a significant heating bill, which he'd put on expenses for his second home in his constituency. People made the point that he could well afford, on the basis of his personal wealth, not to take parliamentary expenses. What made it worse is that the heating bill was for his stables.
Yeah.
Now, I'm all in favour of MPs riding, particularly if they're riding to hounds. I think it adds to the gaiety of the nation. And certainly in Warwickshire, as you would know better than me, I'm sure there's some very fine hunting country, but
Absolutely.
It's probably not a good idea to have the taxpayer subsidise that. And it's probably not a good look, if you are Chancellor of the Exchequer, to be investigated by HMRC over your tax affairs. Now, in the end, Nadhim settled, but it did mean that he had to resign from the office that he then had as Tory party chairman. And so therefore there is, as I say, there is a practical edge, I'll put it no more strongly than that, to Nadhim's operating style. Now, that practical edge lent him brio and elan as vaccine minister. But that takes me to another thing, which is that I think it was Zia Youssef who made the point this week that when it came to dealing with the blob, that Nadhim would be able to see round corners and help them out and so on. Nadhim has gifts, and he is undoubtedly a fluent and effective political salesman.
It was a good speech yesterday, didn't you think? Very well written.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. As I say, he's engaging, he's smart, but what he is not is a technocrat. So Nadhim is not the person to rewire Whitehall. He is the person to issue a rallying call, he is the person to provide...
I remember when he was in the running to potentially to be Tory leader, something that some of his advocates were saying is that you basically get Boris Johnson with less baggage. You get some of that kind of bounce and optimism that people at that time enjoyed in Boris Johnson, but you get someone who's better at putting in the work.
Yes, and I think, again, there's a sort of desire amongst some to have trouble-free transformation. There's a belief that you can have, by sheer force of will and personality and bonhomie, the change that you want to see. Now, I actually think that if one looks back at Boris was a smarter, more thoughtful guy than many people allow, but what he didn't do is apply himself as he should have done to some of the hard work of transforming government, either through inclination or misjudgment. But Boris is, he's Richard Feynman. He's Albert Einstein in comparison to Nadhim. Nadhim, when you say he's Boris without the baggage, it's Boris possibly...
With quite a lot of baggage, I would say.
Boris
that's not my view. I'm saying what people said to me at the time.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But the thing is that he's also... He doesn't have even the experience of delivery, genuine delivery, that Boris had when he was mayor of London, because the work of vaccines was driven by the Vaccine Task Force, which was led by Kate Bingham. There was a very, very, very good civil servant called Maddie McTurnan who drove this process alongside Kate Bingham. Nadhim was principally the evangelist he was very successful, actually, in overcoming vaccine hesitancy and vaccine resistance and providing a sort of focal point for it all. But it wasn't as though he was the Oppenheimer of the Manhattan Project. And that's why I think there is still a gap in reformist prospectus for government, because if they need engineers, Nadhim is not an engineer.
One thing I find quite puzzling in all of this is the way that so many of the high-profile defections have so far been strong Boris Johnson supporters. They've been from his wing of the party, whether that's Jake Berry, Nadine Dorries, some probably less famous people like Leon Nietzsche and now Nadhim Zahawi himself. But Farage hates Boris. Boris hates Farage. And the other question I have for, why Reform UK has welcomed so many Boris acolytes is that particular time in the Conservative Party is when immigration got ratcheted up to previously unseen levels, which is partly explains why Reform is doing so well.
Yes.
I mean, is there not a question there about why it is that they're willing to find a home for so many of these Boris supporters, but also people who, unlike Danny Kruger, which we talked about when he defected, was orders of magnitude different, not least because he was a sitting MP. So, that there was, it didn't quite have that same sense of an opportunist looking to put their toes back into the political waters.
And I think that there are at least two factors uniting or covering most, though not all, of the defectors. You're right, Danny Kruger is a significant exception to this. The sort of Boris aura reflects two things. One, there were a number of MPs who won their seats in Boris's general election victory in 2019, or saw their position significantly augmented then, who were broadly in the red wall. And that's the area where Reform is strongest. So I'm not saying this is the only reason, but were one to be Jake Berry and were one to want to come back into the House of Commons, on current polling, Reform would seem to be a boat that is floating on the neap tide rather than the Tory vessel. So, in that sense, and again, I don't know if this is the case with Leon Nietzsche and Grimsby or with Jonathan Gullis and Stoke-on-Trent North, rather. They're in a better position if they want to get back into the House of Commons at the moment with Reform.
Absolutely.
The second thing, though, is that there's a sort of aura around Boris. In the days of the old Roman Republic, there were the austere, stoical senators, grave and careful, your Ciceros and your Catos and so on. And then there were the adventurers, your Catiline, your Julius Caesar, your Mark Antony. And what marked out the latter was a certain brusque impatience, and if you want to use the word populism, they weren't really that small c conservative. Now, it's a matter of taste, which you are, but the latter, that sort of Caesarist element, is there very strongly in the character of the folk who've gone over. And again, Jake Berry is a bit like Nadhim in that Jake is someone who is charming and entertaining and a good talker and good with business people. And but he's not the sober-sided figure that a small c conservative administration would have in charge of the finances. So you might put Jake and Nadhim at the front of the forecourt flogging the Jags, but you would not have them reassuring the investors that every penny was being spent as wisely as it should be.
So there's a kind of spivery to some of these people.
Well, I was trying not to use that phrase because,
you did say car dealers.
Again, the problem is that people might say, oh, well, you old Tory you, or they might use another four-letter word, Gove. You're expressing sour grapes, bitterness, etc. towards these folk. And I'm trying to be fair, and I'm trying to sort of delineate a difference. Because again, I'm inevitably shop-soiled and tarnished by dint of having been in government, and I can't be wholly objective. But what I'm trying to do is to draw a distinction between those people who have not and would not join Reform, even though there might be some sort of ideological overlap. And here, the curious exception, as you quite rightly pointed out, is Danny, because whatever else Danny Kruger is, he's emphatically not spivvy or Caesarist. He is, as it were, the Cicero or the Edmund Burke of this all, and that is the curious thing. And were I, and of course I'm never going to be asked to be, a reform strategist, I would think, I think we've probably got enough pirates. I think we've probably got enough adventurers. We need some really serious folk.
Who do you think would be at the top of their wannabe sort of fantasy defections list? Because they must be having conversations with dozens of MPs and former MPs.
To answer your direct question on who Reform would love to have, I think that they would love to have, from the current crop of younger Conservative MPs, those who are unambiguously thoughtful and can grapple with government. Katie Lamb, but also people like Rob Jenrick and Neil O'Brien, people who've really...
Could they forgive Neil O'Brien's horrific positions on lockdown?
If they can forgive Nadeem or Nadine, then...
True.
Then
I think Neil O'Brien went further than they did
his
particular targeting of journalists and commentators.
But nevertheless, he's a super smart guy, one of the really most effective junior ministers of the last government. So I don't think he would defect in a month of Sundays. However, that's a type of person. Then there's a second type of person, which is the greybeard whose deep experience of government might provide a sort of laying on of hands. So if a Peter Lilly or a Michael Howard, I don't think they would for a second, were to move over. From Reform's point of view, what that is you get someone from the golden age of Thatcherism who's still not, a very, very sharp mind. I mean, I know that Peter was a huge fan of chemis, actually, so it would never happen. But that's the sort of thing. Then the third group would be people who've delivered, who have some experience of government, but who are not necessarily thought of as political. So to take two names at random, the aforementioned Kate Bingham, leader of the Vaccine Task Force, and someone like Professor Jonathan Van Tam, JVT, who was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer during COVID, both because they are bureaucracy busters, and in JVT's case, because he's a very effective communicator. Again, I don't imagine for a moment, Kate is married to Tory MP Jessie Norman. Doesn't mean that she's got exactly the same views as him, quite the opposite.
No.
But I can't imagine that either of them would. But those are the three sorts. So it's either young and proven, old and grave, or independent and effective. And there hasn't been evidence of that so far.
I think they'd really like to get someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, actually, because I'm sure there have been myriad conversations and he is asked about it all the time and disavows it. I feel like that would be a real Ravens leaving the tower moment if they were to get Jacob Rees-Mogg. But I don't think they will, because for him, being a Tory is kind of crucial to his identity. Yes. So he will go down with the ship, so to speak.
I think that's right. And I think Jacob has also indicated that he sees it as his role to play some part in bringing Reform and Conservatives together. And he would want to do that from the point of view of being a Conservative who's never been disobliging, obviously disagreed with, but never been disobliging about Reform. I think that is a extremely unlikely and fraught enterprise, but he's sincere in that belief. And I don't think that, therefore, he would defect, because both in terms of his self-perception and in terms of his mission, it would be counterproductive. The other question, of course, as well, is that once you become a Reform person, you do have to disavow your past. And I was discussing the Conservative record last week on GB News with Layla Cunningham, who is the Reform candidate for Mayor of London. She's a very impressive person, actually.
Yeah.
But
it was a Tory councillor, wasn't she?
The difficulty that she had, I mean, you know, she knocked 7 bells out of me in all sorts of areas, because she was able just to denounce the last 14 years by lighting on all of the mistakes that the Conservatives made and not spending any time on any of the achievements. Listeners will call in to say there weren't very many, but never mind that. But her Achilles heel, I should say that her Achilles shin was that she was elected as a Conservative councillor in 2022. And as I didn't point out, but should have done, she tried to get selected as a Conservative candidate in 2024. So she wanted to fight as a Conservative candidate in the general election,
Why
which
didn't
I
she get
stood
selected?
down. I don't know.
She's very talented and very exceptionally good at media.
Yeah, quite.
I have to wonder what they were smoking that they wouldn't want to have someone.
No, she is. And again, I don't...
There's something wrong with the CCHQ candidate process.
Yes. So the first thing is that it is the case that you do have to have this complete disavowal, which means that you sound a bit like a sort of standard politician in that people will think, well, if you can so readily denounce everything that in the party that you were in until, just a year or 2 years ago, are you really, a different type of politician? And your second point, I think, is a critical one, which is the process of talent refreshment within the Conservative Party has given rise to frustration amongst lots of people. So there is a risk for the Tories that a number of people who had thought that they wanted to contribute to public life and had thought that the Conservative Party was the route will now be thinking, is reform, notwithstanding everything else, is it likely to be more open, meritocratic, and less, how can one put it, cosy?
I mean, just fundamentally, I wonder if what this defection shows is also that, we've been talking about the political calculation. It could be that Reform are thinking more in terms of, it shows this decline of the Conservative Party, this inexorable drift, but also perhaps a recognition that the terms of the debate has felt things have changed a little in the last few months, that immigration remains probably number one or number two issue, but the economy has risen right up in salience, and it has actually helped the Conservatives to reclaim something of what they had lost. I mean, not enough to win, but that the next, perhaps there's a recognition here that the next election is likely to be is going to be fought on the economy and immigration. So you have to have some credibility on both fronts.
Yes.
I think one reason that Keir Starmer, for example, every opportunity harps on about, let's crash the economy, is because it annoys him that Labour have actually fallen behind the Tories in terms of trust on the economy. Given how untrusted the Tories were on the economy, that took some doing, but they managed to achieve it in a matter of, a year or 9 months or however long it has been.
I think that net, the Tories are still ahead this year in comparison to Reform. And I think you're right because of the increasing shift to the economy. And I think without, I wish Nadhim well, but I think that he's in a mildly diminished position as a result of this, and so are Reform. After the break, we'll be discussing about two dictatorships which are facing a revolt. The public anger on the streets of Tehran against Ayatollah Khamenei, and also the commons' anger directed at Elon Musk. Over the course of the last few days, we've seen incredibly brave individuals on the streets of Tehran and other Iranian cities protesting against the regime of the Ayatollah Khamenei, the rulers of Iran who've been in place since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. We've also seen a violent response from the regime's supporters and the promise or threat from Donald Trump that he might intervene in order to ensure that the protesters are protected and that, I hesitate to say democracy, but certainly that change comes to Iran. As you look at these protests and as you contemplate the Middle East overall, Maddie, are you filled with a sense of hope or foreboding?
It's too early and too difficult to say if these protests are it. They certainly seem bigger than any I can remember in recent years, and there are routine flare-ups. Often every few years in Iran there will be a surge of protest and then an absolutely brutal clampdown from the regime, and that's exactly what's happening this time around. We now appear to have full confirmation that the regime is using military-grade weapons against civilian unarmed protesters. Although the official death toll is said to be 2,000, to my knowledge, there are people on the ground speaking to Western journalists and saying that the reality is likely to be much higher, perhaps closer to 5,000 or 7,000, which is an astonishingly high number in a very short amount of time, which seems to be echoed by the people that are able to make contact, which is obviously difficult now that the internet has been closed down. The comms of it are really difficult, but as always, the absolute courage of the people of Iran is astounding. It's something I've written about before. In 2024, when President Raisi, brutal president, he was known as the Butcher of Tehran, died in a helicopter accident, there was a massive outpouring of celebration. You've videos of men and women, but particularly women dancing in the street. The daughters of a protester murdered by the regime were putting videos of themselves toasting his death and this kind of thing. All of this is potentially a death sentence in Iran, but they continue to do it. Their bravery is astonishing. But I think without seeing, for example, protesters taking control of key infrastructure, perhaps the parliament, I'm not sure we're there yet to be able to say this is it for regime change.
I fear that you're right. So I would desperately like to see change in Iran, not just because it would be a liberation for people who've been suffering under the most grotesque oppression, an oppression which, as you say, has once again been horrifically violent, but also because one would hope, that you can't be sure, that if there were a change in Iran, that would advance the cause more broadly of peace in the Middle East, because Iran has been the sponsor of violence in Yemen through the Houthis, in Lebanon through Hezbollah, in Gaza through Hamas, and Iran, of course, was the biggest sponsor and supporter of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So you can't know what would happen if there were any change, but it would be hard to think of a worse situation. It's possible. But the process of changing a government, when that government is armed and determined to stay in power, and the opposition, as far as one can tell, is principally led by angry merchants, enraged students, dispossessed civilians, unless there is a fracturing within the regime itself, then I would worry that it will be able to reassert control. So in Syria, a very different country, Bashar al-Assad, through sheer ruthlessness, was able to hold on to power until eventually the forces arrayed against him were able to overpower him. But he was fighting a civil war against armed groups. And what we have in Iran is not a monopoly of force, but a concentration of force on the side of the regime. All the moral weight is on the side of the protesters, but wickedness, if it's armed, can survive for a very long time.
There's a feeling perhaps in Iran that with Khomeini being in his late 80s, at least maybe older, that it's kind of now or never. But in the past, the regime has sometimes played a kind of divide and rule game. So it's hard to know if there is the sign of disagreement, if that disagreement is real or it's part of a kind of eternal ploy. I do think it was interesting that there were some mullahs appeared to be coming out, not coming out against the regime altogether, but showing some discontent with how things have gone. There were scholars at I can't remember what it's called, but it's the kind of Iranian main theological university. It's kind of considered to be their equivalent of like a Oxbridge, where the theological colleges are, and historically an enormous bulwark for the regime. And there were enormous anti-regime protests there, and there were also videos of scholars saying that the regime is discrediting Islam.
Yes.
So that seems to me highly significant in terms of people who've historically been on side maybe showing some discontent. Ditto the fact that shopkeepers have come out overwhelmingly against it. The protests are believed to have started in Tehran's Grand Bazaar,
Exactly.
if I understand that correctly.
Yes.
This is definitely not my area of expertise, but again, a group that was historically sympathetic. So these things are significant, but it's not a fair fight between, these are ordinary lay people, civilians, against a highly armed secret police. One of the fascinating things that has changed, even compared to, say, 15 years ago, is that we now have X, and things like Telegram. So you get often videos direct without anyone necessarily explaining exactly what's happening in the video. But it's not this heavily curated mainstream media experience. You see things and you rely on, let's say, there are a lot of people with great expertise who are explaining things on X. But there was a video that showed plainclothes secret police, but they were speaking in Arabic rather than Farsi, which suggests that mercenaries, perhaps from some of the groups that you mentioned earlier, Hamas or Hezbollah, which suggests that maybe, if they're having to recruit from outside, there's an element of, we need mercenaries. That's not usually a great sign for the regime. I think the big question is what happens with the army. What happens if the army were to sort of turn against the regime and towards, say, the Shah? That will be something to definitely keep an eye on.
Yes, and there are different currents. When I worked at the Times, I worked under an extremely wise woman who was the chief leader writer, an expert in foreign affairs called Rosemary Reiter. And Rosemary had a pithy way of describing Iranian politics. She said the difference between an Iranian extremist and an Iranian moderate is that an Iranian moderate is an extremist who's run out of bullets. But behind that, she and others would explain that there are different currents. You're absolutely right. So there is a very strong, understandable nationalist and patriotic feeling that Iran is, historically, a cultural superpower which has exercised military prestige and a form of, I don't know if you could call it moral or cultural leadership. There is deep suspicion, historic suspicion, in Iran about outside and external interference, particularly as it happens from Britain, given our history. And that has been annexed to the Islamist fervor that the Ayatollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader of Iran following 1979, was able to harness at that time. And there were, right at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, some people on the left who saw it as an opportunity to ensure a more equitable allocation of resources to overturn the corruption of the Shah's regime. As time has gone on, there are different strains within the Islamic Revolution. And it is also the case that nationalist feeling has been manipulated by the leadership in a particular way that many of Iran's citizens, we know, feel uncomfortable with. And again, there'll be a calculation following on from what happened in Venezuela, which was an ally of Iran's, that if there is miscalculation amongst the elite about what happens, they could find themselves on the wrong side of a Trump intervention or on the wrong side of a change. And Tom Tugendhat, who from his past in the military and in the Foreign Office and in the nexus between the two, understands Iran. Tom has been making the point that there are people within the regime who are seeking to make an accommodation with forces outside. So it's a volatile situation, but I'm still just a little bit pessimistic because I think that we've been here before, and the people with the most to lose are the most ruthless adherents to the regime. Yeah, and they have the advantage of a monopoly on that level of violence. I'm really confused by the mixed messages coming out of America, actually. The fact that on the one hand, there's been bullish talk about leave the protesters alone, but on the other hand, there's been discussions about reopening some kind of nuclear deal discussions with Iran. Isn't it the case that much of what the West has got wrong in previous years was being too open to those sorts of discussions with Iran? Well, on a personal level, I think that we've mishandled diplomacy with Iran in the past and that Iran has run rings around us until recently. But it's certainly the case that from Iran's point of view, faced with sanctions, faced with a more assertive view from Trump, they have suffered internally, economically. And that has given rise to the widespread unhappiness that you alluded to earlier, and also particularly to the merchant class, the commercial class in Tehran, the operators within the bazaar. But what about the pre-Trump decisions? Like under Obama, the JCPOA. Oh, well, I think that was a disaster. Yeah, precisely. Yeah. I mean, because I think that sanctions relief in exchange for they promised limitations on their nuclear capabilities. Yes, quite. But obviously, you're dealing with Iran. It's not going to be worth the paper that it's written on. No, completely. And that's why I think that Trump was right to launch the strike against Fordo and to seek to degrade Iran's nuclear capability. Because, again, the drive on the part of the regime's leadership to acquire a nuclear weapon and a delivery capability was never, it could be masked or cloaked or hidden, but it was never going to be disavowed. They had run rings round past American presidents and France, Germany, and Britain. And, the UK itself has been naive in the face of Iran. And, there are various figures like Cathy Ashton, the former EU High Representative, and even Jack Straw, who normally is a very sensible guy, who've, been seduced by the idea that they can talk Turkey with the sophisticated figures in the Iranian Foreign Affairs Ministry and so on. But in fact, what they're not doing is penetrating the black heart of Iran's establishment, which is determined to press ahead, has always been determined to press ahead with this program.
Over the weekend, there have been many calls for the social media platform X to be banned in the UK. This comes after its inbuilt AI machine, Grok, has been creating deepfake images of people, but predominantly women, in response to user prompts, specifically putting them in a kind of bikini. We hear that Ofcom will be investigating this, and numerous MPs, particularly on the Labour benches, are calling for a total ban. What do you think is going on here?
Well, I am a bit suspicious. So I'm not in favour of using social media or AI in order to demean or belittle individuals, and certainly not to post pornographic or semi-pornographic images in public which are ugly, demeaning, and exploitative. But I'm also a bit wary about the piling on against Musk and X. And I am wary because Musk has become elevated by your Ed Davies and your Labour backbenchers into a grotesque bogeyman.
Yes.
And the truth is, well, my truth, is that through Starlink, Elon Musk has brought internet connections to parts of the world through the way in which you have community notes on X. He's replaced essentially a centre-left content moderation system with something closer to a digital commons through the work that he's doing on electric vehicles, on spaceflight, on driverless cars, and also through his championing of openness towards AI and towards his own algorithms. He's a much more, certainly complicated, but much more, not benign, but beneficial factor in the world's life than you would sense from the denunciation that is piled on him. So I would draw a distinction between concerns about the way in which Grok is operating and the way in which this particular AI function is being deployed, and Musk and X overall.
Yeah, I remember when Musk bought out then Twitter, rebranded as X, and the sort of conventional wisdom amongst much of the commentariat was that Musk's so stupid, he's going to lose loads of money on this, like what a moron. And I just thought it was kind of interesting that there were all these people that I'm sure, some very intelligent people, but they were quite willing to basically say with utter confidence that the guy who invented Tesla, Starlink, rocket ships, etc., is so stupid that he doesn't understand what he's getting himself in for. But they totally misunderstood. What he actually wanted was to create a space where there would be a greater opportunity for free exchange, and was worried by some of the well-documented censorship that happened during lockdown in particular, where social media companies were strong-armed by governments, including our own, into suppressing certain information. So, I think there was an element of just wantonly misunderstanding and underestimating someone who, whatever you think of him, objectively has achieved probably the single greatest living entrepreneur, I would say.
Yes.
Wouldn't you? Kind of the things that he's achieved, things that we were told were impossible, things that NASA struggled to do. You know.
No, he's a genius. Now, there are all sorts of questions about his private habits, and there are, all sorts of allegations about, how he spends his downtime. Put that to one side.
Yeah.
The achievements that you...
Geniuses are often weird.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
The achievements that you've listed are hugely significant, and they're testament to a powerful intelligence. And maybe he's got some views that I might find disagreeable. But the whole point is that his stewardship of the platform allows me and a variety of others to profoundly disagree with him.
Yes.
And also, the challenge here with Grok is a tiny, tiny scintilla of a hint of what the problems might be, or challenges as well as opportunities with AI. Because if you think that the worst thing that could ever happen as a result of artificial intelligence is the application of bikinis to images,
I know.
then you're completely underestimating.
I mean, I wish I could put that genie back into the bottle.
Yes.
I wish it wasn't happening, but
No.
it is, and it's not it's one of those profound technological changes that
Yes.
there is no stopping it.
No,
so it's a case of working out how best to use it.
Precisely.
And to our national advantage as well, and to the West's advantage.
Totally. So if it is the case that this leads to a wiser debate about artificial intelligence, how you align AI with what we consider to be the right values, about the safety of AI and all the rest of it, great. What I suspect will be the case is that the argument will be used that AI needs to accept all sorts of DEI requirements, and that I think there'll be another argument as well about whether or not we create a new set of misogyny, hate crimes, and so on, all of which I think will be an attempt by the progressive left to control and tame this technology in a way that is in conformity with their ideological worldview. I think that there are big questions about what AI portends and significant questions about social media and guardrails that need to be debated. But let's not automatically accept the good faith of many of those arguing for a particular set of restraints, because we know that they come from an ideological place just as defined and just as contestable as Elon Musk's.
The other question is what government intervention might actually achieve. I mean, this is
Yes.
what Keir Starmer said to his own backbench MPs at the meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party on Monday. The actions of Grok and X are absolutely disgusting and shameful. We'll stand up for the vulnerable against the powerful. We will control Grok if Elon Musk and X do not. But firstly, I find it quite funny that he said the actions of Grok, because Grok is an automated AI, it doesn't
Yes.
really it's not a sentient being, not yet. I also strongly get the impression that for all of this fighting talk, the American administration is very concerned about issues of free speech, and they've correctly identified that there is a problem in Britain. We have a very high number of, for example, people being arrested over tweets.
Yes.
Compared to even quite authoritarian countries like Belarus, we are doing particularly badly on that metric, and it's something that has really got onto the American radar, and they're very conscious of it. I just very strongly feel that if they were to kind of create new rules for X, like one phone call from JD Vance would make them halt and stop in their tracks. We've basically made it clear that our policy is going to be cuddling up to America as best we can, because we've left ourselves in such a geopolitically weak position that we have no alternative.
I think that's true, though it will be the case that Starmer, because of his still relatively weak political position, arguably weaker than ever, will be caught between two things. On the one hand, and we saw this over Venezuela as well, the one area which, until recently, he was generally assumed to have performed competently were foreign affairs and the handling of Donald Trump. And he was always able to say it's in the UK's interests, economic interests, that given our tech sector, given the trade deal that we have, that we maintain that good relationship. But increasingly, because of the human rights and international law questions over Venezuela, and now the questions over the unattractive nature of much that's appeared on X, the Labour Party and the broad left are increasingly unhappy. They sort of accepted that argument beforehand, but they now have concrete examples of actions by Trump and those that are Trump adjacent that they really hate. So Starmer is forced to choose, or increasingly forced to choose, between defending the achievements of his Trump whispering or acceding to the backbench anger at what they see in Caracas and on X.
Yes.
And I think he will increasingly move towards the latter.
And it's interesting that this is something that the Liberal Democrats bring up in Parliament again and again. They're constantly bringing up Elon Musk and Trump's actions.
Yes.
And not even at moments where, as we're experiencing currently, that there's some major intervention that is affecting the world that we ought to talk about. They basically bring up Trump every week, regardless of what is happening in America. So clearly that there is felt to be a constituency of people who, I think it's well known that Trump is very unpopular in Britain, but they clearly feel that there are real votes in it.
Yes, and of course, Westminster held its breath and the world shed a tear when Layla Moran, the Lib Dem MP for Oxford West and Abingdon, announced that she was leaving X last night. I don't know if you got that news, Maddie.
I did not.
I'm sorry to have to break it to you in this podcast. You may need to take some time to compose
Pass
yourself.
the smelling salts.
Yes. But when the Lib Dems, some of my best friends are Lib Dems, but when the Lib Dems sort of say, we must take on Elon Musk,
I was like, what the hell do you think you're going to do about it?
I remember, in the 80s, all the cars of, lefty friends which had nuclear power, 9 Duncan on the side. And I thought, you're being asked to have a cruise missile in your background. In your backyard.
When I was at university, I remember there was a JCR-wide motion to not recognise the state of Israel. You could just imagine, Bibi, someone coming over to him, tapping on the shoulder, saying, "I'm sorry, but Somerville JCR has decided not to recognise your existence." Oh shit,
Yes. No, quite. And the whole thing of the performative thing of I'm leaving X, making the announcement as though there are hundreds of thousands of people who'd been waiting for your next tweet and who are now thinking, with Layla's departure, the final shred of legitimacy that this platform had is gone. I must immediately, and then you look down, visit her on Blue Sky, Insta, and all the rest of it.
They never go away for long. They can't resist. They always come back.
Yes.
And Blue Sky is becoming its own particular echo chamber. It's the kind of, there is obviously some crazy stuff on X, and I do think the algorithm has changed, and it's sending people in a more right-wing direction, which is partly why Labour and other MPs are so against it. But the same thing is happening on Blue Sky, the Twitter alternative, where there are all kinds of mad, deranged conspiracy theories too.
Yes, again, 2 points briefly. One is that Elon has said that he's going to share his algorithm, make it public, be totally transparent about it, allow it to be interrogated. Let's see what happens. But the second thing is, I know you've been reading The Rage of Party, the brilliant book by George Earls about English politics in the beginning of the 18th century. One of the things it brings out is that you had pamphlets and journals at that time with the most scabrous material.
Absolutely.
That it is the consequence of a technological change and free expression, the more ready availability of the capacity to write, disseminate, and print, and a coffeehouse culture at that time. The most outrageous things were said and written, but do you know what? We got through it.
Yeah.
And in the same way...
a Gilray cartoon.
Precisely.
Yeah. Which obviously is later than those years, but it's a feature of 18th century, and the stuff that was coming out of pre-revolutionary France as well. I mean, it's all predictable in the cartoons.
Yeah,
what will happen to the monarchy.
So there's a lot that's offensive and there's a lot that's slop out there. But this is not the real threat, technological threat or challenge that AI poses. That is to mass unemployment, the shredding of jobs, and particularly the potential advent of advanced general intelligence and the whole questions over control. Now, we may return to these issues. These fears may be misplaced. AI is certainly going to increase productivity overall. But it just seems to me that it is easier for people to replay debates about free speech, to clutch their pearls about misogyny and so on. And again, it's horrid.
Yes. Because people are horrible.
Yes.
People say horrible things on social media because people are fundamentally can be horrible. And
Yes.
I don't think that the progressive left really has an answer to this. They tend to view everything as kind of perfectible and correctable, and
Yes.
people can be kind of chivied into a better direction. And I'm not sure that we really have the power to do that. And in fact, the Conservative Party is also calling for social media bans for children, basically. Yes. And this is also a very popular idea, I think in part because some people crave the idea of, frankly, the state stepping in to correct their children because they no longer feel up to doing it themselves.
I'm sure that's true. It's an old friend of mine, John Nash, Lord Nash, who's introducing an amendment to ban social media for those under the age of 16. Another friend of mine, David Willits, made the point that a conservative is a libertarian who's had children. And I think that John, who's a natural libertarian, as someone who has been deeply involved in education and seen the disruptive effect of social media and smartphones in schools, absolutely understands the need to have the state acting as the enabler of, within schools and within families, a pushback against it. But I do think that there needs to be a distinction drawn between saying that something is harmful for children, but open to adults, and a distinction between the protection of innocence under the age of 16 and the acceptance that the price of freedom is that there will be slop and scandal washing around social media. But as a grown-up, you have the opportunity to say, I completely reject that. I'm not going to waste my time doing that. It's time for me to switch off and pick up Mansfield Park instead.
I just think there's a bit of a weird paradox at the moment where in some ways the direction of policy is towards giving younger people more and more rights and opportunities, that the right to vote, and treating them as adults in certain scenarios, but also infantilizing them in others.
Yes.
Taking them off social media. There's also new rules from the government which basically say that there have to be longer periods before a young driver can actually get a license to pass.
Yes, quite.
So basically infantilizing people in all these documented ways, but also needing to protect them. But also weirdly, when it suits us, we'll decide that you're an adult after all. It's all very confusing.
It is, and so much of it speaks from a restless urge to interfere, an urge which it's always better for government to resist.